You're listening to audio from the Decidedly podcast. For more information, find us on Instagram at Decidedly Podcast.
Have you ever had a toxic relationship?
No.
Never had like a crazy girlfriend or anything?
It's weird. I have friends who've had crazy girlfriends or and crazy wives.
That sounds worse.
Much worse, I would imagine. I've never had one. I've only had the one wife, and she's not toxic or crazy, which is good.
That's good.
And just a few girlfriends, but they were all fine. I mean, so I guess I'm not toxic.
I guess you're not.
How about you?
I had one that, I had one not go very well for me. I dated this girl for like, I don't even know if I would say dated. We went on a few dates and maybe like 3, 4.
Okay.
Max 5. I don't know. It's been a few years. And I was about to go out of town for like 3 weeks and she was texting me a lot and I was kind of sitting there thinking like, okay, I don't want to be in this anymore. I don't want to do it anymore. I don't want to wait 3 weeks and like have her wonder why I'm not doing a good job of texting her back. Let me just call her up right now and tell her like, hey, like, I don't really want to do this. So I call her up, which I thought was a respectful thing to do. And the phone call went like about how you'd expect. She was like, well, why? Right.
Yeah.
She tried to explain without giving reasons. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like,
right.
Nobody really wants to hear the reason.
Nobody does.
So I just kind of like, hey, like long term, I don't see this leading to marriage, and so I'm just gonna call it right now, and
yeah,
that's all. You didn't do anything wrong, and so I hung up the phone. I thought it was fine. Thought it was all good.
Okay.
Well, I had the unfortunate, Fort Worth's a small town. About a month later, I was out on a date with someone else.
Oh no!
And sure enough, I see her. I see her from across the park. We were at a dog park, across the park. And she starts like walking over to me. And then she's getting closer and closer.
and you're like, oh no.
And I'm like, oh, she's coming to talk to me. Okay. So I stand up as she gets closer. And then she kind of enters like that bubble where I'm like, oh, are we going for like a hug here or what? And so I go for like a hug and she didn't move at all. And I was like, okay, so maybe I misread that. And I back away. I was like, hey, how's it going? And she starts yelling at me.
Oh no.
She's like, you said you weren't ready for a relationship and look at you're here with this skank. And I was like, oh
no.
Like in public. Okay, we're at a dog park. There's other people here. And I just had to eat it. Like, what do you do? Like, what am I going to yell back? Like, I just had to go, okay.
No, you got to take it like a champ.
You just take it. And then obviously the relationship with that chick didn't go anywhere. That was so. Now that happened twice more.
Oh no!
I ran into her in public.
She got her vengeance on you.
Yeah, I could not avoid this chick.
Oh,
kept running into her.
You dodged
and
a bullet.
She would yell and scream and
dodged
throw
a bullet. Imagine if that had been like a real relationship.
Well, imagine if that was like a 2-year-long thing.
Yeah.
Oh man, I'd be on a Carrie Underwood song by now. Speaking of toxic relationships, our guest today is an expert. Gloria Zhang is a registered psychotherapist and coach for high achievers based in Toronto, Canada. When Gloria was 9 months old, her parents made the incredibly hard decision to send her to China to live with her grandparents. Later, she returned to her parents at age 3. This early childhood adoption trauma began Gloria's attachment and inner child wounds. From age 3 to 10, she developed severe OCD, eating problems, insomnia, anxiety, depression, and a crippling need to people please. Luckily for Gloria, her first love was a psychology book. She's been on her therapy journey since. She was a preteen and immersed herself in the world of inner child healing, self-love, and proper nutrition. Inspired by her early childhood trauma, she became a registered psychotherapist and dating and relationship coach. Nearly a decade later, the work is still her life's passion, and you would hardly tell she's been through it. She helps high achievers break down decades of toxic patterns, find healthy relationships, and manifest their ambitions to their fullest potential. She has her master's in counseling psychotherapy and hosts the very successful Inner Child podcast. We talked about some wonderful topics and really, I started this thinking, what can toxic relationships help me as a business owner? And I was pleasantly surprised by how valuable this content is, even as a leader in my own business. We talked about tackling a root cause approach, so solving your problems versus covering symptoms with a Band-Aid, the timeline exercise of documenting childhood experiences, recognizing your past so you can intentionally make decisions not based off of your trauma, and how toxic relationship patterns in romantic and familial life can bleed over into your business. Stick around, learn something, find out if you're toxic. I'm Sanger Smith. As always, I'm with my dad, Sean Smith, and this is Decidedly. Gloria, thanks for being here.
Hey, 3 times the charm, right?
Yeah, we've been battling technical difficulties, and so now we're good to go. I'm really
blaming
glad.
all of those on Gloria? Or
Yes.
just,
Yeah.
okay.
No, 100%. It couldn't be our fault.
Just throw me
We're
under the
pros.
bus, guys. It's cool.
Yeah, no. I'm sure that Shauna is really glad that you're here, because it's 2 against 1. It's people who have suffered childhood trauma at the hands of their parents, and then Sean. I'm joking, of course.
You're about to suffer some adult trauma. So, Gloria, we were talking earlier in preparation for our talk. I had done a little bit of research in looking at your position on how you deal with childhood trauma and how that creates a lens and a framework for how we make decisions today. And looking at your background, it was really interesting because you had some, we'll call it childhood trauma that went all the way back to when you were a baby. Tell me a little bit more about that.
The trauma that happened to me when I was 9 months old, just to cut to the chase, I was separated from my birth parents, right, at 9 months, and shipped overseas and adopted by some other family. And it wasn't out of malice or anything, but my parents just couldn't afford to take care of me at that time. And then when I was 3 years old, I fell asleep, was put on a plane, shipped back here to Canada, and basically handed back to my parents, who I didn't even recognize anymore. Now, to people in the past, this was not a big deal, right? Naturally, you would give your child to someone who could take care of you. But from what we understand now with attachment trauma, this is an absolutely horrendous experience for young children. Young children learn to form their first human relationships before the age of 1. And it's a really big deal because that sets the blueprint for all of your future relationships, right? And that's why everyone was making, they were freaking out about, the children being separated from their parents and the whole shenanigan in the States, right? With foreigners.
On the border crisis?
Yes, exactly. Right. It is very deeply traumatic to children to be ripped away from their parents without any sort of understanding or explanation. Literally on a very deep biological level, right? Disrupts that attachment.
So it's interesting thing about that type of childhood trauma because the consequences of it aren't always immediately visible, right?
Uh-huh.
So we don't see it, right? And I think a lot of people, maybe even I was guilty of this mindset before reading and educating myself on it. Is that, well, how bad can it be? Right? I don't see, they seem fine.
Yeah.
It's like the old classic, I got beat as a kid and I turned out all right.
Suck it up, buttercup.
Yeah. Like, well, you're not necessarily going to see a physical response to that trauma in a 2-year-old child. Right. But it's going to, what you're saying is it's going to impact that kid forever.
Exactly. Yeah.
So how do you see that manifesting itself? Not, there's a lot of versions of childhood trauma, right? There's
Yes.
an infinite number, I guess. How do you typically see that type of trauma manifesting itself in adults in how they are making decisions or how they were approaching decision making?
Excellent question. I want to first preface this by saying that not everything is trauma. And I feel like I have to give that disclaimer, right? Because with with this rise of mental health awareness, I think it's really great, but there are other people pushing back and saying, aren't you just trying to make every normal thing, right, fit into this definition of trauma? And that's not what we're talking about here, right? This is, real evidence that we've discovered through research. Trauma, by definition, involves the disruption of the nervous system, right? And when a person experiences something in their life, that really gives them a hard time regulating and finding a sense of safety afterwards, right? This is not just going to Starbucks and they get your name wrong and now you're traumatized, right? Like that we're talking about something that's actually real. It shows up in relationships 100%, right? And it shows up in your business, in the way that you approach clients and the way that you bring chaos into your business structure, into your team. It shows up in everywhere, is essentially what I'm saying. And a person can be very high functioning in certain aspects of their lives. But if you have, attachment trauma from the parents in your life when you were really young, that's going to show up in all of your relationships. How can it not? Right? If the very foundational blueprint of how you show up in relationships was like messed up before you could even speak, it shows up in how safe you feel with other people. So I'll just give a couple of examples. You find that some people just turn Jekyll and Hyde when it comes to dating relationships, right? They seem so calm in their day-to-day life, and they turn into this absolute, deranged monster when they're dating someone or in a relationship, right? Why does that happen? It's because they're being triggered by an intimate relationship that very closely resembles the same dynamics as the same that they had when they were with their mother and father, right? You look at client relationships, right? People who are afraid to show up in their businesses, right? They're afraid of being seen. They're shrinking back and censoring their message and people pleasing other clients. Why is that? Because that is coming from an original wounding that started long, long before you became an adult and started your business, right? So TLDR, it shows up everywhere.
That's internet speak for too long didn't read.
Right.
Had to fill Sean in and you wouldn't know that. That's a Reddit lingo right there.
Expose myself as a Redditor.
Yeah, man, both of us did. So you were young. You obviously were unaware even at the time when you did get sent back to, or I guess I can't say back to China. You weren't born in China, but sent to China. And then so young that, I think most people who are not as well read or educated on this topic would say, 3 years old, how can anything go wrong? When did you realize that you had issues stemming from this moment? Because I would imagine that it wasn't at age 3 that you were conscious of this, right? Was it 15? Was it later in life? Was it adulthood?
I didn't realize this until I was older, that the level of paranoid anxiety I had as a child wasn't normal, right? So I think I did experience that at a young age, but I was so little that I didn't have the paradigms and the language to explain, what I was feeling at the time. But where it really showed up, right? I was a high achiever in school. Like I did well in with my grades and everything. That was fine. But how I talked about the monsters, right, that we become in relationships, that was me. Right? I was very quiet and put together at jobs and at school, and that was part of the mask that I created. But I was this crazy ass girlfriend when it came to I just became a different person, right? I was so obsessed with, sometimes breaking into their social media accounts and just so hysterically paranoid, right, about them leaving me. Even in situations where there was absolutely no evidence, right, that they were cheating or anything. But yet in my head, I had this relentless narrative that every single person I was with was going to leave me or abandon me. And it took going into this line of work for me to make that connection that maybe what happened to me at 9 months old wasn't just a blurry memory in the past, right? Maybe that actually had a much deeper, significant impact on me than I thought. So, yeah.
So when you started to realize that, how easy was it for you to make that connection? Was it an aha moment? Was it a lot of deep work that caused you to arrive at that conclusion, or was it somewhere in between?
It took a long time to find the right way to go about it. I have a lot of thoughts on modern day mental health, but essentially what I was noticing was that things like cognitive behavioral therapy, like that's very popular in this day and age, it wasn't getting to the root of what was actually causing this chain of behavior. It was sort of addressing these superficial symptoms, right? Like, oh, you're just anxious, or oh, you just have obsessive thoughts. But it didn't get to the heart of what was driving this. And that's when I really discovered inner child work.
Okay. So are you saying that a lot of the work you saw initially was dealing with targeting issues and saying, well, this is anxiety?
Yes.
Without going back and saying, well, why is this person anxious? Why is this person anxious in the first place? And you found that this, in your psychotherapy work, going all the way back to childhood, was instructive in determining that?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's like a doctor giving you Robitussin for your cough, right? But maybe the reason why you have that cough is that you have a parasitic infection or something, right? There's always a root cause to the symptoms, and it's the cause that creates the symptoms, not the other way around. And
finding the root cause necessarily is more difficult than identifying the symptoms, right? The symptom is a minimal amount of training required to be able to notice what anxiety is or what a persistent cough is, right? But to find, identify, and then solve for the root causes is so much more difficult, because the root causes are much more varied than the symptoms. And so whether that's physical health or mental health, I think it's obvious that the responses that we get to treat the root symptoms are going to be less helpful than the responses to the symptoms. And I've experienced that in my own life, where I have got problems, whether it's anxiety or anger, general controlling my emotions as a kid. The advice I got was all about the symptoms. It was there was never any exploration of the root cause. I had to kind of do that on my own. But it's funny, because when you outline it, I think a lot of people miss this. When you outline it and you tell the story as you have to us today, I think most people go, oh, well, duh, like, obviously. Like, well, obviously, you got to, abandon when you're a little baby. Like, of course, that's going to get
you're going to have abandonment issues, obviously.
You're going to have attachment issues, of course.
Duh.
Yeah. It's like, that's not, even for the person who experienced it, even for you, it's not as easy to identify that. So my question for you is, how can people go about identifying what their own root issue is? Because one thing I've noticed, a lot of people, when they do try to find that root issue, there's a couple of things that can go wrong. One is people may exaggerate the impact of a root cause simply because it's the root cause that they can identify, or rather it's an early memory that they can identify.
One they remember. Yeah.
They remember this thing. This thing seemed like it was kind of bad, therefore it must be the root cause, and therefore it must be responsible for all of these problems, right? And then that gets exacerbated if there's this tendency on the part of the individual to remove their own responsibility and say, oh, well, geez, that's because I was abandoned as a kid. And they just fall back on everything there. And they may have misidentified the root cause. Or the second is they never find that root cause, and they spend so much time searching and searching and searching and searching. And then as long as they're searching, right, they're working. And as long as they're working, then they're making progress, right? So they'll feel really good about, hey, well, I'm searching, I'm exploring, we're uncovering, right? So my question was buried somewhere in that diatribe.
Sanger, that's so deep.
I guess I'm asking.
Big questions.
Let's explore that, Sanger.
Okay. I guess what I really want to know from you is, what mistakes are people making, or what tips do you have for people who are trying to uncover what that root cause is for themselves?
Yep. I think I know what you mean, right? Because if we try to look for something, the brain is going to find something to match that hypothesis, right? So there are I'm sure there's certainly cases where, folks have incorrectly connected certain memories and decided that that was the reason for X, Y, Z. But there is this quote I use a lot, maybe it's helpful, that whatever happened to you, that wasn't your fault, in the sense that it was something that happened to you, right, when you were very little. But healing from that is now your responsibility. So that kind of takes away the, blaming all your problems on someone else in the past, right? It's an explanation for why you are the way you are. It explains the behavior, but it's not an excuse for you not taking responsibility for your own actions. So I think that's a very important distinction to make. So one of the exercises that I actually do with folks is something called a timeline, especially if you just don't really know what happened to you back then, right? Some people really don't have a lot of clear memories. And part of the reason is that if something was really, truly disturbing, your brain doesn't really want you to think about it, right? It's a protective mechanism. So people will actually have blocked memories that they never are able to access. But to me, it doesn't matter, right? So in the timeline exercise, you're actually, going year 1, year 2, going through each different age of your life and just documenting some of the most significant things that happened to you when you were younger. So the reason why this is important is that this is focusing now on the patterns, not necessarily any one specific event, right? So most people don't have memories before age 5, right? It's like the childhood amnesia. So we're never going to be able to access those memories. But if you're noticing that, between the ages of 7 to 21, there are just things that keep happening, right? Where you keep being around certain kinds of people that don't treat you well, or let's say your parents went through a divorce at age 8, and then when you were 10, you moved schools, and when you were 12, someone bullied you in school. It's not necessarily one particular event, but it's the combination of all of these events.
There's a theme.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a theme. That matters more than trying to, rack your brain for specific details. So, yeah.
So about the memories that people black out from their existence.
Yeah.
How do we know it's real? Nobody remembers.
Yeah.
Well,
that really gets me. Is like, what if there was something that happened to me that I don't remember?
Well, there probably was.
Well, okay, so remember, you'll know this story. I used to have this vivid memory of something that didn't happen. At least nobody believed that it happened, and then I was convinced that it didn't happen. So I had this memory in my head of my grandpa spanking me really hard, like. Ooh. Beaten, like, just, I was terrified of ever upsetting him ever again. And I told the story like 10 years later. I mean, I was like 15, and one of my cousins was acting up, and I said, well, you better watch out. Like, Papa's going to spank you. And they go, the whole family looks at me and goes, no, he's not. And I go, oh yeah.
This would have been out of character.
I go, he spanks hard too. And it was so out of character for everybody or for him, that nobody believed that could ever happen to me. Nobody believed that he had ever done it. Everyone was like, there's no chance that he would have ever done this. And so I was like, had to kind of, I believe that it didn't happen to me, based on the response that I got. And so it's like the inverse of that memory where I go, I guess if I can believe something that didn't happen, maybe I can forget something that did.
Yeah.
But how do you identify? What do you even do with that?
Yeah.
You can't find it.
Dr. Gabor Mate, he's like one of the top psychologists that you see on master class and everything. He had a really good quote for this, and maybe this will help Sanger. He said something to the effect of, it's not specifically what happened to you, but it's what happened inside you as a result of how you perceived that event.
It's not what happened to you, it's what happened inside you because of how you perceive that
event. Exactly,
okay.
Right? So we're never going to know what happened to you exactly. I'm sorry that thing might have happened.
I mean, I guess nothing happened.
I feel bad.
No, everyone agrees nothing happened.
Yeah.
It's completely made up. I think, when you made the comment about we don't have memories before the age of 5 or so, that the impact of being in that environment and how that caused you to react probably still lingers, even if you don't remember the event. And you certainly wouldn't remember being shipped to another country at age 9 months, but it probably impacted development, reaction, and connections and so forth that you obviously carried forward. So how do we look at things that happened when we were children and reconcile that with the fact that everybody has stuff? Like nobody grew up in an idyllic environment where nothing happened. Something happened to all of us because we were raised by flawed humans in a flawed society. So stuff happened. How do we know what happened that's impacting us versus the stuff that we ought to just shake off and go, hey, everybody had to deal with that. Everybody got bullied. Everybody, you know what I mean?
Yeah. You don't want to get to a place where you're blaming other people, right? As I mentioned, for what happened to you. I think part of healing is recognizing that all of us are imperfect in the way that we show up. And when you live with another human being or raise another human being, you're going to make mistakes, right? You are going to hurt them. But inner child healing it focuses on building yourself up first so that you can actually get to that place of feeling good about these different relationships. So that's what it's really all about.
Yeah, and I think the danger sometimes when people look at things that have happened in their past or how they were raised or what trauma they've experienced, I think the problem can happen when people attach to those events or that trauma, and that becomes their identity, and then that colors how they're making decisions. They're making decisions based on only that framework, and although that framework might be useful, it can't be the only framework that I look at when analyzing a choice or decision or way forward, things like that. So you had mentioned this timeline exercise just a minute ago, and I went through that exercise, not exactly the way you've described it, but in a group that I was in a few years ago. And
awesome.
What this person had us do was to just go through, sort of the ages, 0 to whatever, wherever we were now. And the line just would go up or down based on were you feeling in a positive or heightened emotion or really great, or was it neutral, or was it bad, or was it awful? And so it was really interesting as I drew that to go through points where I felt low, and it was a low point for me. I shared this with Sanger a while back, and he goes, how could that have been low? All these great things were happening to you at the time. I said, let me tell you about these other things that were happening at the time. And so it was kind of interesting. I think it's a really good exercise to go through because you're able to then assess what was going on. You're able to reflect on that and use that to say, all right, here's how I'm in touch with that emotion. I can use that moving forward. You had an interesting experience I wanted to explore in terms of getting in touch with emotions. I think you did a podcast recently about an ayahuasca experience that you did. Can you tell me about that?
I was battling for 2 years. I've been trying to release that episode, and I was scared too, right? Because I come from a scientific background, all right? Like I did the school, the blah, blah, blah. And I know that talking about something like ayahuasca is just so counter to the culture that we live in, right? So it took me a while to warm people up to the idea of this. I went 7 years ago, right? As you know, during one of like the worst low points of my life. And it was really out of a desperation, right? I had run out of options. I just wanted to get fixed, right? And I just assume all podcasters know about, DMT and ayahuasca and all that. Because that's, I love Joe Rogan and all of that. But essentially it's the spirit molecule, right? It's a natural molecule that makes you hallucinate, but others argue that maybe there's more to this than just hallucination. And I had a very eye-opening experience that sent me in the right direction, of course. But what was really interesting was I was begging, the spirit world to fix me. And they were pushing back at me and said, Gloria, we ain't here to solve your problems, right? You have to stop, you have to go back to Toronto.
Was that a realization that you came to, or was that a communication you received?
Yes. Because it's exactly like you said, Sean. I had this huge attachment to the trauma identity. I was a victim, right? And this showed up in business as well. Like when things didn't work out with certain projects or with clients, I felt like people were attacking me personally, right? I took I was a victim in my own business. And that's why my first business flopped, right? This was old trauma showing up. And so the insight I got was basically, girl, you got to fix your own shit. Stop, doing drugs in the middle of the Amazon looking to fix your life. But they should.
So that's a funny realization, right? Because you're looking for a quick fix, but in a way the substance provided you with the answer, which is this isn't going to magically fix it.
Right.
And that sounds like a really
if you were looking for a solution and that was the realization or the message that you got, which was fix your stuff, then that solution worked for you, right? I mean, that's worth the trip, literally and figuratively. That was in Peru.
It's an island called Iquitos, and there are several retreats on that island. Yeah, there's like wild chickens, like flying monkeys, all kinds of stuff, all sorts of bugs I've never seen before. Oh, I was there for about a month, and I did.
Oh, wow.
I think 5 ceremonies in total.
Oh, this is a way more involved than I imagined. I thought you just kind of flew down and did a little deal and.
No, I stayed for a while.
Is that normal? Is that what most people do? Do they go down there for that long, or is it was yours just extended for some other reason?
I felt the need to get away from my home situation for a proper amount of time, but I met people there who, have been there for months even, right? And one of the guys that he was an American guy from Texas, I think. He went one day and he just never left, and he ended up working for the place.
Did you find that you were getting incrementally better at realization of what was causing you to think about things differently? Did the first one sort of take you to a place and you're like, oh, I like that, I'm going to do that again? Or in other words, what I guess my question is, were the benefits incremental over these multiple events, or the same?
Have you guys done it? I'm kind of curious now.
No, I haven't. It terrifies me.
Yeah. Well, you're not wrong for feeling that way. I try my best to explain it, but I felt safe because they were 2 shamans working with us, right? They were quite experienced. And I just had to make myself believe that, they're there to protect the space, right? So that's really the only reason I felt comfortable staying for so long. But when you're faced with not just your, deepest, darkest stuff and just forced to look at it, you're also encountering these beings, right, of what I described. That messes you up, right? That's going to completely shift the way that you look at things. So it was very scary for sure.
So when you have this realization and ultimately the realization is to stop being a victim and that you need to do the work on your own to improve your life, that seems like a really positive, healthy relationship with it. I think the fear for me would be that I go in there and I get like so off the deep end of this realm that's, separated from reality, and I just never come back. Right? I'm so off, and then I don't ever apply anything back to real life. That's what would terrify me. So when you come back, and you start to do the work, what did it mean to do the work to fix what was wrong?
Yeah, that's really where it all started, right? I had those same fears too of, it's fear of being completely changed or messed up forever. Doing the work, if I could put it into one sentence, it really meant that everything from now on that happens in my life is 100% my responsibility. It's all on me, right? I can no longer blame other people, present, past, future, for my current circumstances, which kind of, ties this whole episode together, right? I think I used to say this all the time, but I wasn't living it, right? So I would go on a date and then say, oh, that guy is, piece of shit, whatever. Like, he's the reason why I feel this way, or he was doing this, no, like, it was all me. I was the common denominator.
Interesting.
In
Yeah,
all the
you could
situations.
blame. That's a really good point. I think I overlook a lot is there are certain relationships that we've had in life that they're major relationships, so we could blame for big problems or persistent problems.
Right.
But we can blame small relationships for small problems, right? That guy that you went on a date with and it ended poorly, right? That's not gonna ruin your life, but even if you let it ruin your week or your day, or I was a jerk to my mom on the phone last night, but that's because that date didn't go well on Tuesday, right? Whatever it is,
exactly.
You could do that on
there's a ripple effect.
Yeah,
Yes.
that victim mentality is going to be both big and small.
Yeah, and like when you don't close a client or something, right? It's like, oh, that person.
Well, that's not my fault. Though.
Yeah, exactly. Like, oh, they weren't the right fit. They sucked.
That's different.
Yeah, but it's
That's
like,
different.
maybe it was your messaging, right? Maybe it was you didn't, approach the sales from their perspective, right? It becomes
that's
so
a really,
personal.
really tempting one that I see for a lot of business owners.
Yeah.
Well, they just didn't get it,
Right.
Like they didn't sign up because they just didn't get it, or they don't care about the value of this thing that I'm selling.
Exactly.
Yeah, I had a manager early on in my career that was really pretty wise about stuff like that, and there was somebody who came back from a sales call and it didn't go well, and he goes, well, how did it go? And he said, oh, those people are idiots, and he goes, as long as you continue to look at things that way, you're never going to grow, and you've got to reflect on what could you have done differently, what did you do that could have been better, even if, and those people might be idiots. They might be idiots.
That's not going to help you.
But if you stop and end it there, you've lost that opportunity of self-reflection to look at, how do I grow and what choices do I make to improve?
That exists. It exists in so many areas of life. I'll hear people do it at jiu-jitsu. They'll be like, oh, well, he's just so flexible. Or that guy, oh, he's just so strong.
Yeah.
Oh, he's really young. What? You lost. Like, maybe he's better.
Maybe you're not good.
Yeah.
How are you not good at it?
Yeah, I'm not only, like, there are weight divisions, and to a degree there are age divisions, but both of those can go away, right? Because older people can compete down in age, and you could compete in open class, which means you're competing without weight divisions. So there's almost no barriers, but there's certainly not flexibility and style. And
there's not a flexibility class.
There's not a strength class. There's not, well, you bench 250, so you got to go up. Yeah. No, that doesn't exist.
That's funny.
Yeah. What other ways do you see business owners applying this mindset in an unhealthy way to their own disadvantage?
Oh yeah. Oh my goodness. The blaming clients thing is a huge one, right? Oh, they don't get my vision, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, maybe you're just not good at what you're doing, right? And it's not translating properly. Team management is huge. There are so many bad CEOs out there, and it's not because they don't have a clear vision. They don't know how to lead teams, right? Teams is just relationships, right?
Yeah.
How many times do I see, burnout from team members, right? Because there's this huge disconnect between what vision you're trying to communicate to your team and your team members following through on that, right? If you don't feel comfortable and safe in relationships, how are you going to communicate that to your team members? How are you going to deliver criticism, right, without getting so overly offended? Blaming team members for things that maybe you could have improved in your delivery, right? In helping people actually understand what you're trying to say. This happened to one of my clients. She had a boss who just kind of disappeared for a few months, and then 4 months later came back and acted so surprised at her day-to-day tasks. But the boss wasn't there, right, to see it develop into this routine in the first place, right? And so how can it be the fault of the employee if the person who's supposed to be the leader, right, isn't even aware of what's going on? So the problem isn't that they made a mistake, right? It's how they perceive that mistake, in this case, deflecting blame onto the other person. That's not going to fly if you're going to run a long-term team, right? Because people are going to mess up. They're going to make mistakes. And unless you can really take back your power and feel comfortable owning up to your own part in this, which a lot of it does come from, childhood trauma, it's going to be very, very difficult. You can have all the communication strategies in the world. You could read 5 books, right, on specific tactics and tools of how to speak to people. But if you can't keep your cool in the heat of the moment, it's just spaghetti on the wall, right? You need to, truly be connected with yourself on a deeper level in order to be able to use those tools. I have a rule with, I lead a team myself, right, about 6 people. And I saw some guy post this online, and since then I've really incorporated this. Any success that happens in the business is because of my team members, right? They're the ones that made it happen. Yeah. But if something goes wrong, that's on me, right? Because clearly I didn't communicate it in a certain way for it to be done, right? So, and as a leader, I have to be willing to be vulnerable with these types of situations, because I cannot risk burning out my team members just because, Gloria can't take a little bit of heat, right? When something goes wrong. Anyways, I'll get off my soapbox with this.
Well, no, it's an interesting point. I think when we deal with carrying forward childhood trauma into current relationships, are you right? And it's inevitable, right? We have that baggage that we bring forward. And a lot of times we find ourselves, not me, but people find themselves in toxic relationships, right? How do you define whether the relationship is toxic and damaging? Like, how do you know that other than just a gut emotional reaction to it?
So if you are in a toxic relationship, it means that you are also toxic, because you're either contributing to it. Yeah, you're either contributing to the dynamic, or you're choosing not to walk away from something that's clearly not working, right? So again, it's the personal accountability. Toxic by definition means poisonous, right? Something that is causing you harm. So if a certain dynamic is causing you harm, right, psychologically, emotionally, then by default, it's not necessarily the person that's toxic, it's the relationship itself that's toxic, right? Something about the dynamic is impacting you in a negative way. So yeah, that's my definition.
Yeah, I heard somebody say one time, and I thought it made some sense, that if something, let's say toxic, happens to you the first time, you're a victim. If it happens to you the second time, you're a participant. And, you've got some culpability in that. So how do you make decisions then to deal with that and get out of that type of environment, whether it's a job situation or a relationship with an employee or boss, or whatever it is, or even a romantic relationship? It seems difficult to see clearly in in the situation because you're in the thick of it.
Yes. And that's very true. When the, what's it called? The wool is pulled over your eyes, right? You can't really see what's actually happening.
Yeah.
Right. And well, bringing it back to trauma, when you're in a trauma response, it's, they say that the frontal lobe goes on offline and you literally cannot think rationally in that situation. So part of the work I do with relationships is actually about you being able to handle your own emotions, right? So we call that emotional regulation. And it's basically, if you're stuck in that confusing, toxic relationship situation, as Sean was describing, your first line of, your first sort of battle to be won is not actually that other person, but it's actually you being able to kind of get your emotions under control first so that you can make a clear decision, right? So if you're feeling I don't love this word, but it feels like you're going crazy around a certain person, right? So every time you go and meet that person, you're filled with so much dread, so much anxiety, and you're left feeling absolutely drained after just talking to that person. Maybe there's a reason why you feel that way, right? And it's not necessarily, yeah. So sometimes it's not the other person. Sometimes it's you, right? That you are not you're not telling that person that you don't like something, and you're allowing it to happen. So I think that to answer your question, the first thing is to trace that emotion back to what is the thing that feels stuck? Like, what's preventing me from moving forward in this relationship? And it's, maybe I don't like the way that she makes fun of my hair. Well, did you tell her that? Right? Did you make it clear? If not, how can you can't blame someone for not knowing something, right? And if you tell them and it's still continuing, then that gives you an indication that, okay, I've already said my piece. Maybe it is the other person. So that's sort of like the logical procedure.
So what do toxic relationships look like in a business owner's life, right? Obviously, when I hear toxic relationship, I'm thinking of romantic relationship. Maybe sometimes I'm thinking of parent-child relationship. But it's occurred to me talking with you that could be a relationship between a leader and their employees or their business partners in a way that's toxic. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. With business partners, employees, clients is where it gets really tricky. Sometimes you kind of, if you have these attachment issues from the past, a lot of people that I've worked with, they actually get into these same toxic relationships with their business partners. So I actually had a client who worked in the legal field and had a business partner, right, with the law firm. And this business partner treated them the exact same way as their mother did when they were younger, right? Very narcissistic, very controlling and patronizing. So it was just very interesting how that exact same dynamic was playing out. This person didn't have a voice in their own business because it was overshadowed by this, narcissistic business partner, right? That's a very clear example. People pleasing, I see that all the time, right? Not having clear expectations around your clients, or chasing after clients because on some level you feel like your message is not good enough, right? So now you have to cater to everyone and just, accept whoever comes through the pipeline, right? And just breaking all of your own boundaries to try to please clients and make them happy and sacrificing your own dignity in the process. That's a really, really common one.
Yeah, I think when we look at those types of relationships, there's decisions that we have to make. I think it's wise to say, I'm going to look first inward before I look outward. I'm going to look at what I'm doing because I can 100% control my actions, my reactions. I can't control this other person at all. What bad advice are you seeing out there with respect to how people make decisions on relationships and carrying forward childhood trauma. I would think there's a lot of bad information that's out there floating around.
Yeah. So just to kind of tie everything together, right? I think the symptom-based approach to fixing problems, I think we see that in everything in general, right? But when it comes to, relationships, whether it's business or personal, if we're just looking at it as, oh, you're just having burnout in your business, right? Let's help you, do a meditation, go exercise for 5 minutes a day. That's not solving the problem of you breaking your own boundaries every time you feel like, oh my gosh, I need to make $5,000 more this month, right? I just got to, go out there and take anyone I get. That's where the issue is really coming from. Right? What is the deeper emotional belief that's causing these symptoms to show up in your relationships? So, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Gloria, how can people get a hold of you and learn more about the work that you're doing?
The easiest way to find me is through my podcast, which is literally called The Inner Child Podcast. We just crossed 1 million downloads a couple months ago, so very excited about that. And you can find it anywhere that podcast stream.
Awesome. Great. Thanks so much, Gloria. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Gloria.
Thanks for having me, guys. It was a pleasure to chat with you.
My takeaway from our discussion with Gloria is different from what I thought it was, because, coming at this as a psychotherapist in dealing with childhood trauma, I was really expecting her to analyze how those traumas carry forward and what to do about how to deal with the trauma. Mm-hmm. And what I got from it, and maybe this is her point, maybe it wasn't, but here's my takeaway, was that we've all got these things, and that the solution starts with how we are dealing with that issue, and that our decision makings need to start with dealing with our own ability to address what we're carrying forward.
Yeah, that's a good principle. Start with yourself before you blame others. My biggest takeaway is that toxic relationships, or relationship problems in general, if toxic seems like too harsh of a word, can exist within the walls of my business as much as they can within my family or my romantic life. It was something that seems very obvious that I was overlooking, is that if I am vulnerable to toxic relationships within my family or in my dating life, then I may be vulnerable to that same level of toxicity in its same type and form with my employees, with my partners, and with my clients. And that was a huge realization for me, to say, well, the things that are causing me problems over here are probably also going to cause me problems over there, although it may not look exactly the same every time.
She had a really good quote, and that was that if you're in a toxic relationship, you're toxic. And I thought that was great. Just to add on to your point.
You just made a great decision to listen to this episode of Decidedly. Make another great decision and leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. We appreciate your support. It helps others find our community and defeat bad decision-making in their own lives. For more daily decision-making insights, check us out at decidedlypodcast.com and on Facebook and Instagram at Decidedly Podcast. Thanks again for listening. I'm Sanger Smith, and this is Decidedly.
Insights, advice, and comments provided by Sean Smith, Sanger Smith, and speakers identified as part of the Decidedly podcast should not be considered recommendations. Speakers not identified as members of Decidedly are expressing their opinion, and their statements should not be construed as reflecting the views of the Decidedly team. This podcast is produced solely for informational purposes, not personalized advice.